Good evening. Tonight, we're going to strip away the marble statues, the romantic poetry, and the sanitized retellings that have made the Greek gods seem like benevolent guardians of humanity. We're going to descend into the original darkness of these ancient tales, where the gods were not wise mentors or noble protectors, but cosmic tyrants, drunk on power, petty beyond measure, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. These were beings who devoured their own children, who turned mortals into monsters for sport, who unleashed plagues and madness upon entire civilizations over the smallest perceived slights. They were rapists, murderers, torturers, and manipulators, who wielded the forces of nature like weapons in their endless games of vengeance and lust. This is not the mythology you learned in school. This is the raw primal horror of the original stories, where mortals were nothing more than playthings in the hands of immortal psychopaths. Before we descend into the wrath and madness of Mount Olympus, leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Let's see how far these ancient nightmares still echo across time and space. The terror begins at the very foundation of the Greek cosmos. In a time before time, when the universe was ruled by beings so monstrous that even the gods we know as cruel were considered an improvement. In the beginning, there was chaos, a yawning void of nothingness that spawned the first primordial deities. From this emptiness came Gaia, the earth herself, who gave birth to Uranus, the sky, and then mated with her own son to create the Titans. But Uranus was a paranoid tyrant who hated his children so much that he forced them back into Gaia's womb, causing her unimaginable agony. The earth itself cried out in pain as her own husband trapped their offspring within her body, until finally she could bear no more. Gaia fashioned a great sickle from adamantine, a substance harder than diamond, and gave it to her youngest son, Cronus, with a simple command: castrate your father. When Uranus came to mate with Gaia again, Cronus struck without warning, severing his father's genitals and hurling them into the sea. From the blood that spilled onto the earth sprang the Furies, those terrifying goddesses of vengeance whose very existence was born from this act of cosmic violence. From the severed genitals mixing with sea foam came Aphrodite, the goddess of love, born literally from an act of mutilation. This is how the Greek cosmos began, not with divine wisdom or benevolent creation, but with a son castrating his father at his mother's behest. Cronus took power, but the oracle's words haunted him. One of his children would overthrow him just as he had overthrown his father. So, when his wife Rhea gave birth to their first child, Cronus did what any reasonable cosmic tyrant would do. He swallowed the baby whole. Not content with this single act of infanticide, he continued to devour each newborn as soon as it emerged from the womb. Picture this scene: Rhea screaming in labor, giving birth to a perfect child, only to watch her husband snatch the infant and swallow it alive. This happened 6 times. 6 times, Cronus consumed his own children, feeling them struggle in his throat as they slid down into the darkness of his stomach. The psychological horror of this cannot be overstated. These were not mindless monsters, but conscious beings, trapped in their father's digestive system, aware but helpless, suspended in a living hell. Hestia, goddess of the hearth; Demeter, goddess of the harvest; Hera, future queen of the gods; Hades, future lord of the underworld; and Poseidon, future ruler of the seas. All spent their early existence in this nightmarish prison, slowly going mad in the acidic darkness of their father's belly. When Zeus was born, Rhea finally rebelled against this cycle of horror. She hid the infant, and instead gave Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes, which he swallowed without hesitation. This tells us something crucial about Cronus. He was so consumed by paranoia and so accustomed to devouring his children that he couldn't even tell the difference between a baby and a rock. Zeus grew up in secret, nursed by a goat named Amalthea, and when he came of age, he returned to his father with a poisoned drink that forced Cronus to vomit up all his children. They emerged fully grown, having somehow survived their imprisonment. But imagine the psychological damage. These future gods had spent their formative years digesting slowly in their father's stomach, and this experience shaped them into the cruel, paranoid beings they would become. The war that followed, known as the Titanomachy, lasted 10 years, and nearly destroyed the universe. Zeus freed the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones from Tartarus, beings so terrible that even Cronus had kept them imprisoned. The Cyclopes forged Zeus's thunderbolts, Poseidon's trident, and Hades' helmet of invisibility, weapons of mass destruction that could level mountains and boil seas. The 100-handed ones, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, hurled boulders the size of cities at their enemies. The earth cracked, the seas boiled, and the very fabric of reality threatened to tear apart. When the dust finally settled, the Titans were defeated, but Zeus's victory came at a terrible cost. He had become everything he had fought against, a tyrant willing to use any means necessary to maintain power. The defeated Titans were hurled into Tartarus, a prison so deep that an anvil dropped from earth would fall for 9 days before reaching its gates. There, they were bound in chains forged from the same adamantine that had castrated Uranus, tortured for eternity as a reminder of what happened to those who challenged the new order. Zeus established himself as king of the gods, but his rule was built on terror, not justice. He divided the universe with his brothers, keeping the sky for himself while giving the seas to Poseidon and the underworld to Hades. But this arrangement was less about fairness and more about keeping potential. Rivals occupied with their own domains. Zeus understood that the only way to prevent his own overthrow was to make sure his brothers had enough power to satisfy their ambitions, but not enough to threaten his supremacy. The true horror of Zeus's character reveals itself in his treatment of mortals and immortals alike. He was a serial rapist who used his divine powers to assault countless women, often transforming himself into animals or natural phenomena to avoid detection. He became a swan to rape Leda, a bull to abduct Europa, a shower of gold to impregnate Danae, and a cuckoo to trick Hera into holding him. These weren't romantic seductions, but violent assaults, carried out by a being with infinite power against victims, who had no way to resist or escape. When Prometheus stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, Zeus's response was characteristically excessive. He chained Prometheus to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, where an eagle would arrive each day to eat his liver. But here's the truly sadistic part. As an immortal, Prometheus's liver would regenerate each night, only to be devoured again the next day. This torture continued for thousands of years, with Zeus fully aware that the punishment far exceeded the crime. Prometheus's screams echoed across the mountains, a constant reminder of what happened to those who defied the king of the gods. But Zeus wasn't content with torturing just Prometheus. He also punished humanity for accepting the stolen fire by creating Pandora, the first woman, as a trap. Pandora was beautiful but filled with curiosity, and Zeus gave her a jar containing all the evils of the world with strict instructions not to open it. Of course, she opened it, releasing disease, death, war, famine, and countless other horrors upon humanity. The only thing left in the jar was hope, which Zeus allowed to remain trapped, ensuring that humans would suffer without even the comfort of optimism. This story reveals Zeus's true nature. He was willing to condemn the entire human race to suffering rather than admit that Prometheus had been right to help them. The god who claimed to be the protector of justice and order was actually a cosmic sadist who created suffering for its own sake. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, was equally terrifying, but in a different way. While Zeus was chaotic and impulsive in his cruelty, Hera was calculated and methodical. She couldn't directly challenge her husband's affairs, so she took out her rage on his lovers and their children, often in the most creative and horrifying ways imaginable. When Zeus had an affair with Io, Hera turned the young woman into a cow and sent a gadfly to sting her continuously, driving her mad with pain as she wandered the earth. Io's transformation wasn't just physical, but psychological. She retained her human consciousness while trapped in a cow's body, unable to speak or communicate her suffering. She could only moo helplessly as the gadfly pursued her across continents, stinging her day and night without mercy. Hera's treatment of Heracles, Zeus's son, by the mortal woman Alcmene was even more sadistic. She sent 2 serpents to kill him while he was still an infant in his cradle, and when that failed, she cursed him with periodic fits of madness throughout his life. During one of these episodes, Heracles killed his own wife and children, an act that haunted him forever. Hera then ensured that his famous 12 labors would be as dangerous and humiliating as possible, often manipulating the monsters he faced to make them even more deadly. The goddess of marriage and family was perfectly willing to destroy families if it served her vengeance. She turned Callisto into a bear after Zeus raped her, and then arranged for Callisto's own son to almost kill her while hunting. She drove Athamas and Ino mad, causing them to kill their own children. She cursed Echo to only repeat the last words she heard, effectively removing her ability to communicate, simply because Echo had once distracted Hera with conversation while Zeus was having an affair. Hera's cruelty extended beyond mere revenge. She seemed to take genuine pleasure in causing suffering, often going to elaborate lengths to ensure her victims experienced maximum psychological torment. She understood that physical pain was temporary, but shame, guilt, and madness could last forever. Her punishments were designed to destroy not just the body, but the very essence of her victims' humanity. The underworld, ruled by Hades, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Greek cosmos, because it represented the ultimate destination of every mortal soul. Death was not a peaceful rest, but the beginning of an eternity of judgment and, for many, torture. Hades himself was not inherently evil, but he was utterly indifferent to human suffering, viewing souls as nothing more than property to be catalogued and processed. The journey to the underworld began with Hermes, the psychopomp who guided souls to the banks of the river Styx. There they would meet Charon, the ferryman, who demanded payment for passage to the other side. Those who couldn't pay, usually the poor who had been buried without coins on their eyes, were left to wander the shores for 100 years before being allowed to cross. This meant that poverty followed souls even into death, creating a system of eternal class distinction. Once across the river, souls faced the 3 judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iolcus. These figures decided the fate of each soul based on their actions in life, but the criteria for judgment were often arbitrary and cruel. Minor offenses could result in eternal punishment, while major crimes sometimes went unpunished. If the perpetrator had honored the gods properly, the fortunate few who lived virtuous lives were sent to the Elysian fields, a paradise where they could exist in eternal bliss. But the vast majority of souls were consigned to the asphodel meadows, a grey, colourless realm where they wandered as shadows of their former selves, neither happy nor sad, but simply existing in a state of eternal boredom and forgetfulness. The worst fate awaited those who had offended the gods directly. They were sent to Tartarus, where they faced punishments specifically designed to torment them for eternity. Sisyphus, who had tricked the gods multiple times, was forced to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down just as he reached the summit. The psychological torture of this punishment was that he knew it was futile, but couldn't stop trying. Tantalus, who had killed his own son and served him to the gods at a feast, was placed in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree. Whenever he tried to drink, the water would recede, and whenever he reached for fruit, the branches would pull away. He was eternally hungry and thirsty, surrounded by the very things he needed but could never reach. The word tantalize comes from his name, but the original punishment was far more horrifying than our modern understanding suggests. The Danaids' 50 sisters who had killed their husbands on their wedding night were forced to fill a bathtub with water using sieves. No matter how much water they poured, it would always leak out, making their task impossible. They were doomed to spend eternity performing meaningless labor, fully aware that their efforts would never succeed. These punishments reveal the true nature of Greek divine justice. It was not about rehabilitation or even simple retribution, but about creating suffering for its own sake. The gods took pleasure in devising torments that would psychologically destroy their victims, while keeping them conscious enough to experience every moment of their agony. The physical landscape of the underworld was equally terrifying. The river Styx was said to be so powerful that even the gods feared to break an oath sworn upon its waters. The river Lethe caused complete forgetfulness, erasing all memories of life, while the river Phlegethon was made of fire and caused unbearable burning. The river Cocytus was formed from the tears of the damned, a literal river of sorrow that ran through the heart of the underworld. Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the entrance to the underworld, was not just a monster, but a symbol of the finality of death. Once you passed him, there was no return to the land of the living. His 3 heads could see the past, present, and future, meaning that no soul could hide their crimes from his gaze. His breath was poisonous, and his bite was said to drive mortals instantly insane. The underworld was also home to the Furies, the Erinyes, who were born from the blood of Uranus when Cronus castrated him. These were not mere punishment dealers, but embodiments of cosmic vengeance itself. They appeared as ancient women with snakes for hair, blood dripping from their eyes, and bronze wings that allowed them to pursue their victims across any distance. They were particularly focused on crimes against family, especially matricide and patricide, but they would also hunt down oathbreakers, murderers, and those who had shown disrespect to the gods. The Furies' method of punishment was to drive their victims insane through relentless pursuit. They would whisper in their ears, show them horrifying visions, and fill their minds with guilt and terror, until they either confessed their crimes or destroyed themselves. Orestes, who killed his mother Clytemnestra to avenge his father's murder, was pursued by the Furies until he went completely mad, seeing them everywhere and hearing their voices even when he was alone. What made the Furies truly terrifying was that they were incorruptible. Unlike other gods who could be bribed or reasoned with, the Furies were pure instruments of vengeance. They had no concept of mercy, no understanding of extenuating circumstances, and no interest in proportional punishment. Once they marked someone for punishment, they would pursue them literally forever, across lifetimes if necessary. The god of war, Ares, represented the most brutal and senseless aspects of violence. Unlike Athena, who embodied strategic warfare and justified conflict, Ares was pure bloodlust and chaos. He took pleasure in the sounds of battle, the smell of blood, and the sight of young men dying in agony. He was accompanied by his sons Deimos and Phobos, the personifications of terror and panic, who would spread fear across battlefields. Ares' relationship with Aphrodite revealed another disturbing aspect of the Greek gods, their tendency to romanticize violence and destruction. The goddess of love was irresistibly attracted to the god of war, and their affair produced children who embodied the connection between love and violence. Eros, the god of passionate love, was sometimes said to be their son, linking romantic desire directly to the impulse to destroy. The story of Ares and Aphrodite being caught in a golden net by Hephaestus, Aphrodite's husband, is often told as a humorous tale of adultery, but it reveals something darker about the god's nature. When Hephaestus discovered the affair, he crafted an invisible net so fine that it couldn't be seen or broken, and he trapped the lovers in the act. Then he invited all the other gods to come and mock them. The gods' response was not outrage at the adultery, but laughter at the spectacle, showing their complete indifference to concepts like marital fidelity or emotional harm. Eris, the goddess of discord, was perhaps the most dangerous of all the gods because she represented chaos itself. She was not satisfied with causing individual suffering, but sought to destroy entire civilizations through conflict and strife. The Trojan War, which killed thousands and laid waste to one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, began because Eris threw a golden apple inscribed with, "For the fairest," among the goddesses at a wedding she hadn't been invited to. This might seem like a petty response to social exclusion, but it reveals the true nature of divine justice in Greek mythology. The gods did not distinguish between major and minor offenses, and they were perfectly willing to destroy innocent people to satisfy their wounded pride. The entire population of Troy suffered and died because someone had forgotten to invite Eris to a party. The transformation myths reveal perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the Greek gods, their tendency to punish mortals by stripping away their humanity entirely. These weren't just changes in appearance, but fundamental alterations of identity and consciousness that left victims trapped between human and animal, aware of what they had lost but unable to reclaim it. Medusa's transformation is one of the most famous examples, but the original story is far more horrifying than most people realize. Medusa was a beautiful priestess of Athena who was raped by Poseidon in Athena's temple. Rather than punish her uncle for this sacrilege, Athena blamed Medusa for allowing the rape to occur and transformed her into a monster whose gaze would turn anyone to stone. Medusa was forced to live in exile, knowing that her very existence brought death to any living being who looked upon her. The psychological horror of Medusa's situation cannot be overstated. She retained her human consciousness and memories, but was trapped in a body that made normal interaction impossible. She could never again look into a mirror, never see another person's face, never experience human touch or companionship. Her sisters, Steno and Euryale, were also transformed into Gorgons, but they were made immortal while Medusa remained mortal, meaning she faced the additional horror of knowing that her suffering would eventually end in death while her sisters would continue forever. Arachne's transformation into a spider reveals the god's inability to tolerate even the suggestion of mortal superiority. Arachne was a skilled weaver who claimed her abilities surpassed those of Athena herself. When they competed, Arachne's tapestry was indeed superior, depicting the god's crimes against mortals with uncomfortable accuracy, rather than acknowledge her talent. Athena destroyed the tapestry and transformed Arachne into a spider, dooming her to weave for eternity, but never again to create anything of beauty or meaning. The transformation of Actaeon shows how arbitrary divine punishment could be. Actaeon was a hunter who accidentally saw Artemis bathing. He had not sought out this vision and certainly hadn't attempted to assault the goddess, but Artemis transformed him into a stag anyway. The true horror came when his own hunting dogs, unable to recognize their master, tore him apart. Actaeon died in agony, killed by the very animals he had loved and trained, unable to call out his identity or beg for mercy. These transformation myths reveal a consistent pattern. The gods were threatened by mortal talent, beauty, or even simple bad luck, and their response was always to destroy what made their victims human. They understood that the cruelest punishment was not death, but a living death that preserved consciousness while destroying identity. The story of Niobe demonstrates how the gods' cruelty extended even to mourning and grief. Niobe was a mother who boasted that she had 14 children, while Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, had only 2. To punish this hubris, Apollo and Artemis killed all 14 of Niobe's children with arrows, leaving her to weep over their bodies. But even this massive loss wasn't enough to satisfy the gods' need for vengeance. They transformed Niobe into stone, preserving her grief for eternity. She became a rock formation that appeared to weep, forever mourning children, who would never return. The gods' treatment of Cassandra reveals their willingness to destroy the innocent to punish the guilty. Cassandra was a Trojan princess who caught the attention of Apollo. When she refused his advances, he cursed her to always prophesy the truth, but never be believed. This meant that Cassandra lived her entire life watching disasters unfold that she could have prevented if anyone had listened to her warnings. She foresaw the fall of Troy, the death of her family, and her own rape and murder, but she was powerless to change any of it. The curse of Cassandra was particularly cruel because it took something precious, the gift of prophecy, and made it a source of constant torment. She became a figure of ultimate frustration, knowing exactly what would happen, but unable to convince anyone to take action. Her prophecies were always accurate, but her inability to save anyone made her gift worthless. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice shows how the gods could offer hope only to snatch it away at the last moment. When Eurydice died from a snake bite, Orpheus descended into the underworld and convinced Hades and Persephone to let her return to life through the power of his music. They agreed, but with one condition: he must not look back at her until they both reached the surface. Just as they were about to emerge into sunlight, Orpheus turned around, and Eurydice was immediately dragged back into the underworld forever. This story is often interpreted as a tragedy of human weakness, but it reveals something darker about the gods' nature. They had the power to restore Eurydice to life completely, but they chose instead to create a test that they knew Orpheus would fail. The condition was arbitrary and cruel, designed to give hope while ensuring ultimate disappointment. The gods took pleasure in watching mortals suffer, even when they pretended to offer mercy. The fate of heroes in Greek mythology reveals how the gods viewed even their most devoted servants. Heracles, the greatest hero of the ancient world, spent his entire life serving the gods and protecting humanity. But his reward was a death so agonizing that he begged to be killed. He was poisoned by the blood of the Hydra, which caused him to burn from the inside out while remaining conscious. The poison was so potent that it couldn't be washed off or neutralized, and Heracles spent his final hours in unbearable agony before finally building his own funeral pyre. Even in death, Heracles wasn't granted peace. He was taken to Olympus and made immortal, but this was less a reward than another form of torture. He was forced to spend eternity in the company of the gods who had made his life miserable, particularly Hera, who had orchestrated most of his suffering. His immortality meant he could never escape their influence or find rest in death. Perseus, who killed Medusa and saved Andromeda, was rewarded with a long life and successful reign. But his descendants were cursed to commit terrible crimes. His great-grandson Oedipus unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, while other descendants were driven to madness, incest, and murder. The gods' gifts always came with hidden costs that were paid by future generations. Theseus, who slew the Minotaur and united Athens, was abandoned by the gods in his old age and died alone and forgotten. His son Hippolytus was killed by Poseidon, at the request of Theseus himself, who had been tricked by his wife Phaedra's lies. The hero who had saved Athens from the Minotaur ended up destroying his own family through divine manipulation. The gods' treatment of Jason and the Argonauts reveals their fundamental untrustworthiness. Jason was promised that if he could retrieve the Golden Fleece, he would regain his rightful throne. He accomplished this impossible task with the help of Medea, a powerful sorceress who abandoned her homeland and family for him. But when Jason returned home, the gods allowed him to be betrayed and exiled. Medea, driven mad by the gods' influence, killed their own children to punish Jason for his infidelity. This pattern of divine betrayal was not accidental but fundamental to how the gods operated. They would inspire heroes to attempt great deeds, provide just enough help to make success possible, and then abandon them to face the consequences alone. The gods enjoyed watching mortals struggle against impossible odds, and they took particular pleasure in destroying those who had trusted them the most. The Greek concept of fate, controlled by the three Moirai or fates, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of their mythology because it meant that even the gods were subject to forces beyond their control. Clotho spun the thread of life, Lachesis measured its length, and Atropos cut it short. Even Zeus could not save someone whose thread was about to be cut, which meant that divine favor was ultimately meaningless. The fates were depicted as ancient women, older than the gods themselves, who worked tirelessly at their cosmic loom. They were blind to human suffering and indifferent to pleas for mercy. Once they had determined someone's fate, nothing could change it. Not prayer, not sacrifice, not even the direct intervention of the gods. This meant that mortals lived in a universe where their ultimate destiny was controlled by beings who didn't even acknowledge their existence. The story of King Laius and his son Oedipus shows how the fates could force people to commit terrible acts despite their best efforts to avoid them. When Laius learned that his son would kill him and marry his wife, he ordered the infant Oedipus to be left on a mountain to die. But the fates ensured that Oedipus would survive, grow up not knowing his true identity, and eventually fulfill the prophecy by killing Laius in a roadside encounter and marrying his mother. Jocasta. What makes this story particularly horrifying is that every character acted rationally based on the information they had. Laius tried to prevent the prophecy by killing his son. Oedipus tried to avoid his fate by leaving what he thought was his homeland. And Jocasta tried to protect her family by sending away the infant. But the fates manipulated events so that their very attempts to avoid the prophecy made it inevitable. The gods' relationship with prophecy reveals their sadistic nature. They would often reveal future disasters to mortals through oracles or dreams, but they would make the prophecies so cryptic that they couldn't be properly understood until after the events had occurred. The oracle at Delphi, Apollo's most famous prophet, was notorious for giving ambiguous answers that led to terrible misunderstandings. When Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, consulted the oracle about whether he should attack Persia, he was told that if he crossed the river Halys, he would destroy a great empire. Interpreting this as a promise of victory, Croesus launched his attack, only to discover that the empire he destroyed was his own. The oracle had told him the truth, but in a way that ensured his downfall. This pattern of deceptive prophecy was not accidental, but reflected the gods' fundamental contempt for mortals. They enjoyed watching humans make disastrous decisions based on divine guidance, and they took particular pleasure in the moment when mortals realized they had been tricked. The gods' indifference to human suffering was perhaps most clearly demonstrated in their treatment of entire civilizations. The destruction of Troy, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, began as a quarrel between three goddesses over a golden apple. Tens of thousands of people died in the 10-year war that followed, including many who had no connection to the original dispute. The gods took sides in the conflict, not based on justice or morality, but on personal preference and old grudges. Athena and Hera supported the Greeks because Paris had judged Aphrodite more beautiful than them, while Aphrodite and Ares supported the Trojans. The war became a proxy conflict between the gods, with mortals serving as expendable pawns in their cosmic chess game. The sack of Troy was particularly horrifying because it involved the systematic destruction of everything that made the city great. The Greeks didn't just defeat the Trojans. They erased their culture, enslaved their women, and murdered their children. The gods not only allowed this atrocity, but actively encouraged it, with Athena helping to design the Trojan horse, and Poseidon preventing the Trojans from discovering the trick. After the war, the gods continued to torment the survivors. Cassandra was raped in Athena's temple by Ajax the Lesser. But instead of punishing the rapist, Athena destroyed the entire Greek fleet on its way home. Agamemnon was murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, who was then killed by their son, Orestes, who was then pursued by the Furies until he went insane. The cycle of violence and revenge continued for generations, with each act of vengeance inspiring new atrocities. The gods' treatment of natural disasters reveals their willingness to cause mass suffering over trivial disputes. When the people of Thebes failed to properly honor Dionysus, he drove all the women of the city mad, causing them to tear apart their own children with their bare hands. When the Trojans failed to pay Apollo and Poseidon for building their walls, the gods sent a plague and a sea monster to devastate the city. These punishments were not proportional to the offenses, but were designed to create maximum suffering. With minimum effort, the gods understood that the most effective way to punish mortals was to turn them against each other, corrupting their natural bonds of family and community until they destroyed themselves. The story of Lycaon shows how the gods could transform even hospitality into horror. Lycaon was a king who wanted to test whether Zeus was truly divine, so he killed his own son and served him to Zeus as a meal. Zeus recognized the human flesh and transformed Lycaon into a wolf. But the true horror of the story is that Lycaon retained his human consciousness while trapped in a wolf's body. He became the first werewolf, forever caught between human and animal, belonging fully to neither world. The god's punishment of Lycaon was not just about his specific crime, but about the broader message it sent to mortals. Anyone who questioned divine authority or tested the god's power would be stripped of their humanity and forced to live as a beast. The transformation was designed to be irreversible, ensuring that Lycaon would spend eternity regretting his decision to challenge Zeus. The concept of divine justice in Greek mythology was fundamentally different from human concepts of fairness or proportionality. The gods operated on the principle that any offense, no matter how small, justified any punishment, no matter how severe. They also believed that innocent people could be legitimately punished for the crimes of others, leading to multi-generational cycles of vengeance that could destroy entire bloodlines. The curse of the house of Atreus demonstrates how divine justice could corrupt families for generations. Tantalus's crime of serving his son Pelops to the gods at a feast led to a curse that affected his descendants for centuries. Pelops won a chariot race through cheating and murder. Atreus and Thyestes engaged in a cycle of mutual atrocities involving cannibalism and adultery. And Agamemnon and Menelaus launched the Trojan War, partly to distract from their family's shame. Each generation thought they could escape the curse through their actions, but the gods ensured that every attempt to break the cycle only made it worse. Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia to appease Artemis led to his murder by his wife Clytemnestra, which led to his murder by their son Orestes, which led to Orestes being pursued by the Furies until he went insane. The curse was only finally broken when Athena intervened, not out of mercy, but because she was tired of the endless cycle of violence. The gods' relationship with justice was further complicated by their own criminal behavior. Zeus was a serial rapist, Hera was a murderer, Poseidon was a destroyer of cities, and Apollo was a liar and manipulator. They committed crimes that would have earned mortals eternal punishment in Tartarus, but they were exempt from divine justice because they were the ones who defined it. This created a system where mortals were held to standards that the gods themselves refused to follow. Mortals who committed adultery could be transformed into monsters, but Zeus's countless affairs went unpunished. Mortals who showed excessive pride were destroyed, but the gods' arrogance was celebrated as divine majesty. The hypocrisy was so blatant that it seemed deliberately designed to emphasize the gods' power and mortals' helplessness. The story of Prometheus reveals how the gods viewed knowledge and progress. When Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, he wasn't just stealing a physical substance, but the foundation of civilization itself. Fire enabled cooking, metalworking, and countless other technologies that separated humans from animals. Zeus's punishment of Prometheus was not just about the theft, but about the broader principle that mortals should remain ignorant and helpless. The gods wanted to maintain a strict hierarchy where they possessed all knowledge and power while mortals lived in primitive ignorance. Any attempt by mortals to improve their condition was seen as a threat to divine authority and was punished accordingly. This meant that every advance in human civilization was achieved in defiance of the gods' will, making progress itself a form of rebellion. The creation of Pandora as punishment for accepting Prometheus's gift reveals the gods' misogyny as well as their cruelty. The first woman was designed to be beautiful but inherently deceptive, created specifically to bring suffering to mankind. Her curiosity, which led her to open the jar containing all evils, was not a flaw but a feature deliberately built into her nature by the gods. They wanted her to open the jar, and they crafted her personality to ensure she would do exactly what they intended. This reveals something deeply disturbing about the gods' psychology. They were willing to condemn all future generations of humanity to suffering rather than admit that Prometheus had been right to help them. The evils that Pandora released, disease, death, war, famine, and despair, were not natural consequences of human behavior, but deliberate punishments inflicted by beings who claimed to be just and wise. The gods' treatment of their own children reveals their fundamental inability to love or nurture. Hephaestus, the god of fire and metalworking, was so ugly that his mother Hera threw him from Mount Olympus immediately after his birth. The fall left him permanently disabled, but instead of showing remorse, Hera continued to treat him with contempt throughout his life. When Hephaestus created beautiful works of art and useful tools for the gods, they accepted his gifts but never acknowledged his talent or showed him affection. Athena's birth from Zeus's head is often portrayed as a symbol of wisdom and strategic thinking, but the original story is far more disturbing. Zeus had swallowed Athena's mother Metis while she was pregnant because he feared that their child would overthrow him. Metis continued to grow inside Zeus's body, and when Athena was ready to be born, she had to be cut out of his skull with an axe. Athena emerged fully grown and armored, having spent her formative period trapped in her father's head, surrounded by his thoughts and fears. This traumatic birth explains much about Athena's personality. She was fiercely loyal to Zeus because she had literally been shaped by his mind. But she was also cold and calculating, lacking the emotional warmth that comes from normal maternal bonding. She became a goddess of war and wisdom, but never learned to love or show mercy, treating mortals as chess pieces to be moved around for strategic advantage. The gods' relationship with their divine children was equally dysfunctional. Apollo and Artemis were born to Leto, one of Zeus's lovers, but Hera's jealousy made their birth a nightmare. Hera forbade any land from giving Leto shelter, forcing her to wander the earth in agony as her labor pains intensified. She finally gave birth on the floating island of Delos, but even then, Hera sent the monster Python to pursue them. Apollo's first act after birth was to kill Python, establishing him as a god of prophecy and purification, but also as a deity defined by violence and vengeance. He inherited his father's capacity for cruelty and his mother's suffering, creating a personality that combined wisdom with ruthlessness. His relationship with mortals was characterized by sudden infatuations, followed by brutal punishments when his advances were rejected. The story of Daphne shows Apollo's complete inability to understand consent or rejection. When the nymph Daphne refused his advances and fled from him, Apollo pursued her relentlessly, ignoring her obvious terror and distress. Only when she begged her father to transform her into a laurel tree did Apollo finally stop, but even then, he claimed the tree as his sacred symbol, ensuring that Daphne could never escape his influence even in her transformed state. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, was equally cruel but in different ways. She demanded eternal virginity from her followers and punished any who broke their vows with horrible deaths. When Actaeon accidentally saw her bathing, she transformed him into a stag and had him torn apart by his own hunting dogs. When the giant hunters Otus and Ephialtes tried to storm Olympus and capture her and Athena as brides, she tricked them into killing each other by transforming herself into a deer and running between them. Artemis's treatment of her followers reveals the god's inability to inspire genuine devotion. Her huntresses were bound to her through fear rather than love, knowing that any mistake or moment of human weakness would result in their destruction. She created a cult of terror disguised as religious devotion, demanding absolute obedience, while offering nothing but protection from her own wrath in return. The god Dionysus represents perhaps the most complex and terrifying aspect of the Greek pantheon, because he embodied both ecstasy and madness, showing how the gods could corrupt even joy and celebration. Dionysus was born twice, first from his mother, Semele, who was tricked by Hera into asking Zeus to appear before her in his true form. The sight of Zeus's divine lightning burned Semele to death, but Zeus saved the unborn child by sewing him into his thigh until he was ready to be born again. This bizarre birth gave Dionysus a unique perspective on both mortality and divinity, but it also made him fundamentally unstable. He understood suffering in ways that other gods didn't, having literally been born from death, but his response to this understanding was to inflict madness on others. He traveled the world spreading his cult, but his worship involved frenzied rituals that often ended in violence and death. The story of King Pentheus shows how Dionysus punished those who refused to acknowledge his divinity. When Pentheus banned the worship of Dionysus in Thebes, the god drove all the women of the city mad, including Pentheus's own mother and sisters. They fled to the mountains and engaged in frenzied dancing and ritual cannibalism. Losing all sense of human identity and morality, Pentheus disguised himself as a woman and spied on the rituals. But he was discovered and torn apart by the maddened women. His own mother, Agave, ripped off his head and brought it back to the city, thinking it was the head of a wild animal. Only when she displayed her trophy in the town square did she realize she had murdered her own son. The horror of this recognition drove her permanently insane, fulfilling Dionysus's revenge, but destroying an entire family in the process. This story reveals how Dionysus used mortals' love for each other as a weapon against them. He didn't just kill his enemies. He corrupted their closest relationships and forced them to destroy the people they loved most. The madness he inflicted was not random but specifically designed to target the bonds that held families and communities together. The god Pan, half goat and half man, represented the wild, untamed aspects of nature that the Greeks both feared and revered. He was known for causing panic, the sudden, irrational fear that could strike armies or individuals without warning. Pan's presence in the wilderness made travel dangerous, as he would appear to lone travelers and drive them mad with terror, causing them to run blindly through the forest until they fell off cliffs or were torn apart by wild animals. Pan's sexual appetite was legendary and terrifying. He would pursue nymphs and mortal women with relentless lust, using his divine power to trap them in remote locations where they couldn't escape or call for help. His half-animal nature made him particularly frightening because he combined human intelligence with bestial instincts, creating a predator that was both cunning and savage. The story of Syrinx shows Pan's complete disregard for consent and his willingness to destroy what he couldn't possess. When the nymph Syrinx fled from his advances, she begged the river gods to transform her into marsh reeds to escape him. Pan discovered her hiding place and cut down the reeds to make his famous pipes, ensuring that even in her transformed state, she would be forced to create beautiful music for his pleasure. Every time Pan played his pipes, he was literally making Syrinx's transformed body sing against her will. The minor gods and spirits of Greek mythology were often more terrifying than the major Olympians because they had less self-control and fewer restraints on their behavior. The satyrs, Pan's followers, were notorious for their aggressive sexuality and their tendency to assault mortal women. They would hide in forests and vineyards, waiting for opportunities to catch women alone and vulnerable. The harpies, half bird and half woman, were sent by the gods to torment mortals through psychological torture. They would steal food from their victims, leaving them to starve. But they would also whisper terrible prophecies and accusations that drove people to despair. Their presence was so foul that they contaminated everything they touched, making it impossible for their victims to find peace or comfort. The sirens used their beautiful voices to lure sailors to their deaths, but their method was particularly cruel because they offered their victims exactly what they most desired to hear. They would sing of home, of lost loves, of glory and honor, creating irresistible visions that made death seem preferable to continuing their journey. The sailors would steer their ships toward the rocks, fully aware that they were choosing death, but unable to resist the promise of perfect happiness. The Gorgons, of whom Medusa was one, were created as punishment for crimes they didn't commit, but they became monsters in both appearance and behavior. Their gaze turned anyone to stone, but they retained enough humanity to understand what they had become. They lived in isolation, surrounded by the stone statues of their victims, fully aware that they had become the very thing they had once feared. The Sphinx, with the body of a lion, wings of an eagle, and head of a woman, terrorized the city of Thebes by devouring anyone who couldn't answer her riddle. But the riddle itself was a form of torture, designed to give hope while ensuring failure. Most people who encountered the Sphinx knew they would die, but the possibility of survival through cleverness made the encounter even more terrifying. The Greek concept of hubris reveals how the gods used mortals' natural desire for excellence and achievement against them. Hubris was defined as excessive pride or ambition, but the line between admirable confidence and punishable arrogance was deliberately kept vague. This meant that mortals lived in constant fear of accidentally offending the gods through their accomplishments or aspirations. The story of Arachne shows how even legitimate skill and talent could be interpreted as hubris. Arachne was genuinely a superior weaver to Athena, and her tapestry depicting the gods' crimes was accurate, but she was punished for having the audacity to compete with a goddess. The message was clear: mortals should never aspire to excellence in any field claimed by the gods, no matter how talented they might be. The myth of Icarus is often interpreted as a warning against excessive ambition, but it also reveals the gods' cruelty toward mortals who tried to transcend their limitations. Icarus and his father Daedalus were imprisoned in the labyrinth that Daedalus had built for King Minos. When they escaped using wings made of feathers and wax, Icarus flew too close to the sun and fell to his death when the wax melted. But the real tragedy is that Icarus was punished for experiencing joy and freedom for the first time in his life. He had been trapped in the labyrinth since childhood, and when he finally escaped, his natural exuberance led to his death. The gods could have saved him or warned him about the danger, but they chose to let him die as an example to other mortals who might dream of rising above their station. The concept of divine jealousy permeated every aspect of Greek mythology, making it clear that the gods viewed mortals as potential threats rather than beloved creations. Any mortal who achieved great success, whether in war, art, love, or wisdom, risked attracting divine attention and punishment. This created a culture of mediocrity where excellence was dangerous and ambition was potentially fatal. The story of Salmanus shows how far the gods would go to punish mortals who dared to imitate them. Salmanus was a king who proclaimed himself equal to Zeus and attempted to create thunder and lightning using bronze cauldrons and torches. His imitation was crude and obviously fake, but Zeus killed him with a real thunderbolt anyway, demonstrating that even pathetic attempts at divine mimicry were unforgivable. The gods' treatment of their mortal lovers reveals their fundamental inability to form genuine emotional connections. Zeus's countless affairs always ended in tragedy for the mortal women involved, who were typically abandoned, transformed, or killed by Hera's jealousy. The gods were capable of lust and temporary infatuation, but they had no understanding of love, commitment, or emotional responsibility. The story of Io shows the complete disregard the gods had for their lovers' humanity. After Zeus raped Io, he transformed her into a cow to hide her from Hera. But Hera discovered the deception and had Io tormented by a gadfly that stung her continuously. Io spent years wandering the earth in agony, unable to communicate her suffering or return to human form. Zeus made no attempt to protect her or alleviate her pain. Having already moved on to his next conquest, Europa's story follows a similar pattern. Zeus disguised himself as a bull and abducted her while she was playing on the beach with her friends. He carried her across the sea to Crete, where he raped her and fathered several children with her. Europa was stranded in a foreign land, cut off from her family and culture, forced to bear the children of her rapist. She was eventually made queen of Crete, but this was presented as a reward rather than acknowledgement of the trauma she had endured. The gods' treatment of their divine children was equally dysfunctional. Ares, the god of war, was despised by his father Zeus and barely tolerated by the other Olympians. Despite being a legitimate son of Zeus and Hera, Ares was treated as an embarrassment because his brutality was too obvious and crude. The other gods preferred their violence to be disguised as justice or necessity, but Ares reveled in bloodshed for its own sake. Hephaestus, despite his incredible skill as a craftsman, was mocked and humiliated by the other gods because of his physical disabilities. When he created beautiful works of art or useful tools, the gods accepted his gifts but never showed him respect or gratitude. His marriage to Aphrodite was arranged by Zeus as a form of compensation for his suffering, but it only led to more humiliation when Aphrodite openly conducted affairs with other gods. The story of Hephaestus's revenge against his mother Hera reveals the depths of dysfunction in the divine family. He created a golden throne as a gift for Hera, but when she sat on it, she found herself trapped by invisible chains. Hephaestus refused to release her until she acknowledged him as her son and apologized for throwing him from Olympus. The other gods were forced to get Hephaestus drunk to convince him to free her, showing that even their family disputes required deception and manipulation to resolve. The gods' relationship with fate and prophecy created a universe where free will was largely an illusion. The Moirai, or fates, controlled every aspect of mortal existence, from birth to death. But they often revealed their plans through prophecies that led mortals to fulfill their destinies through their very attempts to avoid them. This created a cruel form of psychological torture where mortals believed they were making choices while actually following a predetermined script. The oracle at Delphi was the most famous source of prophecy in the ancient world, but her predictions were deliberately ambiguous and often misleading. The Pythia, Apollo's priestess, would enter a trance and speak in riddles that could be interpreted multiple ways. This ambiguity was not accidental but served to protect the gods from accusations of false prophecy while ensuring that mortals would make decisions based on incomplete or misleading information. The story of Oedipus shows how the gods could manipulate fate to create maximum suffering. The prophecy that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother was given to both Oedipus and his parents, but it was phrased in such a way that their attempts to avoid it actually made it inevitable. Every character in the story acted rationally, based on the information they had, but the gods had orchestrated events to ensure their rational choices would lead to tragedy. The concept of divine justice in Greek mythology was fundamentally different from human concepts of morality or fairness. The gods operated on the principle that they were inherently superior to mortals and therefore justified in treating them however they chose. Mortals had no rights that the gods were bound to respect, and any attempt to claim such rights was considered hubris worthy of punishment. The story of Prometheus shows how the gods viewed mortals as property rather than individuals deserving of respect or consideration. When Prometheus stole fire to give to humanity, Zeus's anger was not about the theft itself, but about the principle that mortals should remain helpless and dependent. The gods wanted to maintain absolute control over human development and saw any attempt to improve the human condition as a direct challenge to their authority. The punishment of Prometheus was designed to send a message to both mortals and immortals about the consequences of defying divine will. The daily torture of having his liver eaten by an eagle, only to have it regenerate overnight, was a form of eternal suffering that served as a constant reminder of Zeus's power. The fact that other gods were forced to witness this punishment made it clear that even divine beings were not immune to Zeus's wrath. The gods' treatment of natural disasters and diseases reveals their complete indifference to human suffering. Plagues, earthquakes, floods, and famines were not seen as tragedies to be prevented, but as tools to be used for divine purposes. When mortals failed to provide proper sacrifices or showed insufficient respect, the gods would unleash natural disasters that killed thousands of innocent people along with the guilty. The story of the flood sent by Zeus to destroy humanity shows the gods' willingness to commit genocide over relatively minor offenses. According to the myth, Zeus decided to destroy the human race because they had become too violent and impious. Only Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha were saved, and they were forced to repopulate the earth by throwing stones behind them, which transformed into new humans. This story reveals the gods' fundamental contempt for human life and their willingness to start over rather than attempt to reform or educate mortals. The new humans created from stones were literally dehumanized from their very creation, born without the warmth of natural birth or the love of parents. They were designed to be more obedient and less questioning than their predecessors. The Greek underworld was designed to reflect the gods' obsession with hierarchy and punishment. The three-tiered system of Elysium, Asphodel, and Tartarus was not based on objective moral criteria, but on the gods' personal preferences and prejudices. Heroes who had pleased the gods were sent to Elysium regardless of their moral behavior, while mortals who had committed minor offenses against divine authority were consigned to eternal torment. The judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iolcus, were not impartial arbiters of justice, but enforcers of divine will. They judged souls based on their relationship with the gods rather than their treatment of other mortals. A murderer who had properly honored the gods might be sent to Elysium, while a virtuous person who had neglected their religious duties would be punished in Tartarus. The rivers of the underworld were designed to strip away everything that made souls human. The river Lethe caused complete forgetfulness, erasing all memories of life and love. The river Acheron was said to cause unbearable sorrow, while the river Cocytus was formed from the tears of the damned. These rivers were not natural features, but deliberate creations designed to maximize psychological suffering. The ferryman Choron represented the god's belief that even death should be subject to economic inequality. Those who could afford to pay the ferryman's fee were granted passage to the underworld, while the poor were left to wander the shores for a century before being allowed to cross. This meant that social class followed souls even into death, creating an eternal hierarchy based on wealth rather than virtue. The concept of divine madness was one of the most terrifying aspects of Greek mythology because it showed how the gods could destroy mortals' very sense of self and reality. Divine madness was not simple insanity, but a complete disconnection from human nature. That left victims aware of their condition, but unable to control their actions. The story of the daughters of Pretis shows how divine madness could be used as a weapon against entire families. When the daughters refused to honor Dionysus or Hera, depending on the version of the myth, they were struck with madness that caused them to believe they were cows. They fled to the mountains, where they lived like animals, eating grass and refusing to acknowledge their human identity. The madness inflicted by the gods was particularly cruel because it targeted the victim's sense of self and their relationships with others. The daughters of Pretis were not just insane, they were trapped in a delusion that prevented them from recognizing their own family members or remembering their human lives. Their madness was designed to be both permanent and self-perpetuating, creating a form of living death that was worse than actual death. The gods' use of transformation as punishment reveals their understanding that the cruelest torture was not physical pain but the destruction of identity. When mortals were transformed into animals, plants, or objects, they typically retained their human consciousness while losing their ability to communicate or interact with the world as humans. The story of Actaeon shows how arbitrary these transformations could be. Actaeon was transformed into a stag simply for accidentally seeing Artemis bathing. But the real punishment came when his own hunting dogs, unable to recognize their master, tore him apart. Actaeon died knowing that he was being killed by animals he had loved and trained, unable to call out his identity or beg for mercy. The transformation of Daphne into a laurel tree reveals the gods' complete disregard for consent and bodily autonomy. Rather than simply leaving Daphne alone when she fled from his advances, Apollo pursued her relentlessly until she was forced to give up her human form to escape him. Even then, Apollo claimed her as his sacred tree, ensuring that she could never truly be free from his influence. The concept of inherited guilt was one of the most unjust aspects of Greek mythology, as it meant that mortals could be punished for crimes they had not committed and had no power to prevent. The curse of the house of Atreus shows how divine justice could corrupt families for generations, with each new generation paying for the sins of their ancestors. The original crime of Tantalus serving his son Pelops to the gods at a feast was so horrific that it cursed his entire bloodline. But the descendants who suffered for this crime had no knowledge of it and no opportunity to make amends. They were condemned to repeat patterns of violence and betrayal, not because of their own choices, but because the gods had decided that an entire family line should be destroyed. This system of inherited guilt created a universe where mortals were born already condemned, facing punishment for crimes they had not committed and carrying curses they had not earned. It made moral behavior essentially meaningless, as even the most virtuous person could be destroyed by the sins of their ancestors. The gods treatment of hospitality and guest friendship reveals their hypocritical nature. Zeus was supposedly the protector of guests and the enforcer of hospitality laws, but he regularly violated these same laws through his behavior. He would disguise himself as a beggar or traveler to test mortals' hospitality, then punish those who failed to meet his standards while ignoring his own violations of guest-friendship. The story of Baucis and Philemon shows both the gods' capacity for reward and their typical cruelty. When Zeus and Hermes visited Earth disguised as poor travelers, they were turned away from every house except that of an elderly couple, Baucis and Philemon, who shared their meager food despite their poverty. The gods rewarded them by transforming their humble cottage into a temple and granting them their wish to die together. But the gods also destroyed the entire region, killing all the inhospitable people with a great flood. The punishment was wildly disproportionate to the crime, and it included many people who had simply been too poor or too fearful to take in strangers. The gods' justice was selective and arbitrary, rewarding their favorites while destroying everyone else. The Greek gods represented the worst aspects of human nature, magnified by infinite power and freed from any meaningful constraints. They were petty, jealous, cruel, and utterly selfish, but they possessed the ability to reshape reality according to their whims. This created a universe where mortals lived in constant fear of divine attention, knowing that even the smallest misstep could result in transformation, madness, or eternal torment. The mythology of ancient Greece was not designed to provide comfort or moral guidance, but to explain the fundamental unfairness and cruelty of existence. The gods were not role models to be emulated, but cosmic forces to be feared and appeased. Their stories served as warnings about the dangers of ambition, pride, and the desire for justice in a universe ruled by beings who cared nothing for mortal suffering. The enduring power of these myths lies not in their beauty or wisdom, but in their unflinching portrayal of power without accountability, intelligence without compassion, and immortality without growth or change. The Greek gods were terrifying because they represented the ultimate nightmare, beings with the power of gods but the hearts of the worst humans, ruling over a universe where might made right and mercy was a sign of weakness. In our modern world, we often sanitize these stories, turning them into adventures or moral lessons. But the original myths were horror stories designed to make mortals understand their place in a cosmic hierarchy where they were nothing more than entertainment for bored immortals. The gods of Mount Olympus were not distant, benevolent deities, but immediate, terrifying presences who could transform your life into a nightmare at any moment, for any reason or for no reason at all. This is why the gods of Greek mythology were absolutely terrifying, not because they were unknown or incomprehensible, but because they were all too human in their flaws, while being utterly inhuman in their power. They combined the worst impulses of mortal nature with the ability to act on those impulses without consequence, creating a pantheon of cosmic psychopaths who ruled through fear and maintained their power through cruelty. The ancient Greeks understood something that we often forget, that power without restraint inevitably becomes tyranny, that immortality without growth leads to stagnation and cruelty, and that beings who cannot change cannot truly love or show mercy. The gods of Olympus were trapped in their own perfection, unable to learn, grow, or become better than they were. They were eternal children with infinite power, and like all children, they were capable of breathtaking cruelty in pursuit of their own desires. These ancient nightmares still echo in our modern world because they represent truths about power, authority, and human nature that remain relevant today. The Greek gods were terrifying not because they were alien or incomprehensible, but because they were exactly what we might become if we possessed infinite power without infinite wisdom, eternal life without eternal growth, and the ability to reshape reality without the responsibility to use that power wisely. The darkness of Mount Olympus serves as a warning that has echoed through the centuries. That power corrupts, that immortality without accountability leads to tyranny, and that even gods can become monsters when they lose sight of their responsibility to those they rule. The Greek gods were absolutely terrifying because they showed us the worst possible version of ourselves, magnified by divine power and freed from all moral constraints. They were not aspirational figures, but cautionary tales, reminding us that true divinity requires not just power, but wisdom, not just immortality, but compassion, and not just authority, but responsibility. In the end, the gods of Greek mythology were terrifying because they represented the ultimate corruption of power and the inevitable result of authority without accountability. They were cosmic tyrants who ruled through fear, maintained their power through cruelty, and found entertainment in the suffering of those they were supposed to protect. They were everything that divinity should not be, and that is what made them absolutely, unforgettably terrifying.